I'm about to show you 11 hidden errors that are likely inflating your blood pressure numbers right now, making you believe your health is in decline when it might just be your technique. You might be taking medication you don't actually need, or a higher dose than necessary, simply because of a mechanical mistake you make every morning. The difference between a reading that sends you to the emergency room and a reading that gives you peace of mind often comes down to a few inches of arm placement or a few minutes of patience. Robert came to see me because he was absolutely convinced his heart was failing, and his previous doctor was about to double his medication based on the numbers he wrote down in his logbook. He was 74 years old, a retired engineer who was meticulous about his health, and he presented me with a notebook filled with readings that consistently hovered around 160/95. These are dangerous numbers for a man his age, the kind of numbers that significantly increase the risk of stroke or kidney damage if they are accurate and sustained over a long period. However, when I asked Robert to walk me through his morning routine, the problem became immediately clear to me, even though it had been invisible to him for years. He would wake up, immediately march into the kitchen, brew a strong pot of coffee, and sit down to measure his pressure while the coffee was still brewing, thinking he was being efficient. I told him to change just one variable in that sequence, and when he returned 2 weeks later, his average had dropped to a safe and steady 135/85. We effectively cured his crisis without adding a single pill, and in fact, we eventually reduced his existing medication because the previous dosage was making him feel faint and dizzy whenever he stood up too quickly. Imagine if we had increased his dose based on those false numbers. He could have suffered a serious fall in the bathroom or the kitchen, leading to a hip fracture or worse, all because the measurement did not reflect his true internal state. The scary reality is that many seniors are walking around with a diagnosis that is slightly more severe than it needs to be, simply because their doctor's appointment is rushed or their home routine is flawed. Your doctor might mean well, but they often see you for 15 minutes, and they rely heavily on the numbers you bring them or the single reading the nurse takes when you are already nervous. It is crucial that you become the expert on your own body and the master of your own measurement, because accuracy is the only way to stay safe. Before we begin, a critical disclaimer that you must understand before making any changes to your routine or your lifestyle. The information I'm sharing today is strictly for educational purposes and should not be considered medical advice or a replacement for professional care. I am not your personal physician and cannot provide individualized medical guidance through this video. Never stop, start, or change any blood pressure medication without first consulting with your doctor. The first mistake is something that seems incredibly trivial, yet it can spike your systolic reading, the top number, by as much as 10 to 15 points instantly. This is the mistake of measuring with a full bladder, which is extremely common because many people want to get their measurement out of the way the moment they wake up. When your bladder is full, it is not just an uncomfortable sensation. It is a physiological stressor that sends a distress signal to your entire nervous system. Margaret was a perfect example of this error. She was 72 and treated her blood pressure routine with the same discipline she applied to her garden. She would wake up at 6 in the morning, sit on the edge of her bed, and immediately wrap the cuff around her arm because she wanted the truest resting number before she started moving around. Her numbers were consistently high, often in the 150 range, which confused her because she felt perfectly fine and calm. When she described that fullness she felt while measuring, I explained that her body was actively fighting to hold urine, which triggers the sympathetic nervous system, the fight-or-flight response. This response constricts your blood vessels specifically to maintain pressure during stress, and your monitor picks up this artificial constriction as high blood pressure. It is a biological reflex that you cannot control with your mind. If the bladder is full, the pressure goes up, regardless of how relaxed you try to breathe. I advised Margaret to change her routine. Wake up, go to the bathroom, and empty her bladder completely, and then wait a few minutes before sitting down to measure. The change was immediate and dramatic. Her readings the very next morning dropped by 12 points on the top number, bringing her back into a range that was acceptable for her age and condition. She had been worrying herself sick every single morning, creating a cycle of anxiety, all because she was measuring a body that was under the internal stress of needing to relieve itself. You must understand that a full bladder adds unnecessary resistance to your circulatory system, much like stepping on a garden hose creates pressure back at the spigot. Your kidneys and your bladder are intimately connected to blood pressure regulation, and when the bladder is distended, it signals the kidneys to alter fluid handling and vessel tone. By simply ensuring you use the restroom first, you are removing a massive variable that has nothing to do with your heart health and everything to do with plumbing. This is why doctors often get a lower reading if they let you sit in the waiting room for a while and use the restroom before the nurse calls you back. If you have ever noticed that your pressure is high at the clinic, ask yourself if you were holding it in because you didn't want to lose your spot in line. Always prioritize emptying your bladder before the cuff goes on, as this single step provides a cleaner, more accurate baseline for what your heart is actually doing. Another helpful tip for this specific step is to avoid forcing or straining while in the restroom just to empty out for the test, as straining itself can raise pressure temporarily. Just have a normal, natural bathroom break. Wash your hands with warm water to keep them relaxed, and then proceed to your measurement station. This simple habit supports steadier readings and prevents those frightening morning spikes that ruin your mood for the rest of the day. The next major error involves the physical support of your back and your feet, a mistake that seems to stem from people measuring at the kitchen counter or on a high bar stool. When your feet are dangling or just barely touching the floor, or when your back is not firmly supported by a chair, your muscles have to engage isometrically to keep you upright. You might not feel this muscular effort because you are used to it, but your vascular system certainly feels it and responds by increasing pressure. William was a man who loved his kitchen island. It was where he read the newspaper, drank his tea, and took his blood pressure every single day around breakfast time. He sat on a tall wooden stool that had no back support, and because he was of average height, his heels didn't quite plant firmly on the floor, leaving his legs swinging slightly. He came to me concerned because his diastolic number, the bottom number, was creeping up into the 90s, which is often a sign of increased resistance in the peripheral blood vessels. I explained to William that when his back is unsupported, his core muscles and paraspinal muscles are constantly firing to keep his spine straight and prevent him from slumping. Similarly, when his feet are not flat, his leg muscles are tensed to maintain balance, and this isometric contraction, muscle tension without movement, shunts blood away from the limbs and into the core, raising systemic pressure. It is a subtle form of exercise, and you would never measure your blood pressure while lifting weights, yet sitting unsupported is biologically similar on a smaller scale. We moved his measurement station to the dining room table, where he could sit in a sturdy chair with a solid back and place both feet flat on the floorboards. The difference was remarkable. His bottom number dropped by about 6 to 8 points within a week, simply because his body was physically supported rather than actively holding itself up. He realized that what he thought was a resting position on the stool was actually an active posture that required energy and muscular tension to maintain. You need to treat your blood pressure measurement like a scientific experiment where stability is key. Your back should be fully rested against the chair back, not leaning forward or hovering. Your legs should be uncrossed, with knees at a 90-degree angle and feet planted firmly on the ground to ground your body's electrical and physical stability. Crossing your legs at the knees or ankles is another version of this mistake that can spike systolic pressure by up to 8 points because it compresses the large veins in the legs and forces blood upward. Many seniors unknowingly sabotage their readings by sitting on the side of the bed, which is soft and offers no back support, causing them to unconsciously use their core to stay balanced. The bed is perhaps the worst place to measure unless you have a specifically designed chair next to it, because the mattress shifts and sinks, preventing that solid grounding your body needs to truly relax. Find a dedicated pressure station in your home, preferably a quiet corner with a proper hardback chair, and use that same spot every single time. This is easy on the joints and requires no special equipment other than a standard chair, but it ensures that the numbers you see are a reflection of your arteries, not your posture. If you are physically frail or have trouble sitting upright, You can use pillows to prop yourself up, but ensure that your trunk is passive and supported, not working to stay vertical. This change alone can prevent the false diagnosis of hypertension in people who simply have poor posture during measurement. Before we move to the next item, please take a moment to scroll down and comment your age and your usual top number range. For example, 72 and usually 130. It is very helpful for the community to see that numbers vary wildly and that you are not alone in trying to manage this. I read through these to understand what is common among my viewers, so please share your baseline. A very frequent mistake, especially in the colder months, is placing the blood pressure cuff over clothing rather than on bare skin. There is a misconception that modern machines are sensitive enough to read through fabric, or that rolling up a sleeve until it bunches up at the shoulder is an acceptable workaround. The reality is that fabric acts as a barrier that muffles the acoustic or oscillometric signals that the machine is trying to detect from your brachial artery. Eleanor was a lovely woman in her late 60s who lived in a drafty old house and always wore thick wool cardigans to stay warm during the winter. She was very modest and also disliked the cold, so she would simply push her sweater sleeve up to her armpit, creating a tight, thick bundle of fabric right above where the cuff needed to sit. Her readings were erratic. Sometimes they were dangerously high, and other times the machine would give an error message and fail to read at all. When she did manage to get a reading, it was often 10 to 15 points higher than her summer readings, leading her to believe that the cold weather was tightening her veins. While cold can affect blood pressure, in Eleanor's case, the issue was the tourniquet effect caused by the bunched-up sleeve constricting the blood flow before the cuff even started inflating. Additionally, when she tried putting the cuff over a thinner shirt, the fabric friction created noise that the machine interpreted as a pulse, skewing the numbers. I showed Eleanor that she needed to expose the upper arm completely, perhaps by wearing a loose-fitting t-shirt under her cardigan and removing the outer layer for the 2 minutes it takes to measure. Once she stopped bunching her sleeve and started measuring on bare skin, her numbers stabilized immediately, and the winter hypertension she feared turned out to be a wardrobe malfunction. The sensor in the cuff needs direct contact with the skin to detect the subtle vibrations of the arterial wall as blood rushes back through after the squeeze. Even a thin layer of polyester or cotton can add roughly 5 points to your measurement, and a thick sweater can add anywhere from 10 to 50 points depending on the density. The machine is looking for a very specific vibration, and clothing creates a static that confuses the algorithm, forcing it to guess, and it usually guesses high to be on the safe side. It is worth the 30 seconds of discomfort from the cold air to get an accurate reading that dictates your medication dosage for the next few months. If you struggle with getting undressed or rolling up sleeves, consider wearing loose-fitting short sleeves around the house in the morning with a robe that can be easily slipped off one shoulder. The goal is to have the cuff wrapping snugly around the flesh of the upper arm without any interference or constriction above or below the cuff site. The area where the cuff sits must be a neutral zone, free from the pressure of rolled-up elastic cuffs or thick seams that press into the skin. This is a simple adjustment that costs nothing but ensures your machine is operating exactly as the engineers designed it to. Accuracy depends on the clarity of the signal, and skin-to-cuff contact is the only way to guarantee that clarity. Never assume your machine is strong enough to work through clothes. Treat the measurement with the precision of a medical procedure. Using the wrong cuff size is perhaps the most technically significant error because it creates a mechanical bias that no amount of relaxation can overcome. Most blood pressure monitors come with a standard cuff that is supposed to fit most arms. But most does not include everyone, especially seniors who might have lost muscle mass or those who carry extra weight. A cuff that is too small for your arm will yield a falsely high reading, while a cuff that is too large can give a falsely low reading or fail to register correctly. David was a larger gentleman, a former construction worker with naturally thick arms who had been using the same standard cuff that came in the box with his monitor 5 years ago. He often complained that the Velcro barely held together and that the cuff felt like it was pinching his skin aggressively even before it fully inflated. His readings were consistently showing systolic numbers in the 170s, causing his doctor to prescribe a third medication that made David feel lethargic and weak. We measured the circumference of David's arm and found that he was well outside the range for a standard cuff. He needed a large adult cuff to get an accurate reading. A recent study highlighted that using a regular cuff on a large arm can overestimate systolic blood pressure by an average of nearly 20 points, a massive error margin that mimics severe disease where there is none. Once we switched David to a large cuff that wrapped comfortably around his bicep, his systolic reading instantly dropped to 145. This drop meant he was still hypertensive, but nowhere near the crisis levels that his previous cuff had suggested, allowing us to dial back his medication to a more tolerable level. The physics is simple. If the bladder inside the cuff is too short to encircle enough of your arm, the machine has to overinflate to compress the artery, and that extra pressure registers as your blood pressure. Conversely, if the cuff overlaps itself too much on a thin arm, it distributes pressure inefficiently, often missing the arterial signal or underestimating the force. You must measure the circumference of your upper arm at the midpoint between your shoulder and your elbow using a flexible measuring tape. Compare this number to the range printed on your cuff or in the manual. If you are at the very edge of the limit, buy the next size up or down. Many seniors lose muscle mass in their arms as they age, making their old cuffs too loose, while others might gain weight, making the cuff too tight. Check this once a year as your body composition changes, and do not rely on the universal fit unless your measurement falls squarely in the middle of that range. Using a proper fit is the foundation of the entire process. If the tool doesn't fit the workpiece, the measurement will always be wrong. It is a small investment to buy a replacement cuff, usually around $10 to $15, but it saves you from the priceless cost of incorrect medical treatment. This supports steadier readings and prevents the physical pain of a cuff that feels like a vice grip, which in turn causes pain-induced blood pressure spikes. If you find the Velcro popping open during inflation, that is a guaranteed sign the cuff is too small. Ensure the fit is snug but allows you to slip 2 fingertips underneath the edge before you hit the start button. Talking or active listening during the measurement is a habit that seems harmless but is actually a potent stimulant for your cardiovascular system. We are social creatures, and silence can feel awkward or boring. So many people chat with their spouse, watch the news, or listen to the radio while the cuff inflates. However, the act of speaking requires cognitive effort and breath control, both of which raise your heart rate and blood pressure instantly. James was a very friendly man who viewed his morning blood pressure check as a time to catch up with his wife, who would sit with him at the kitchen table. He would tell her about his plans for the garden or complain about the weather while the machine whirred and beeped in the background. His readings were always roughly 10 points higher at home than they were when he was sitting quietly in my exam room, which is the opposite of white coat syndrome. I explained to James that active listening, paying attention to someone else, and speaking both engaged the brain and slightly increased sympathetic output. When he was talking, his diaphragm was moving, his intrathoracic pressure was changing, and his brain was processing language, all of which prevented his body from reaching a true resting state. I gave him a strict prescription for 2 minutes of absolute silence during his measurement. No talking, no TV, no radio, just breathing. The result was a consistent drop in his numbers, proving that his high blood pressure was partly just the exertion of conversation. Even listening to a fast-paced news anchor or an intense talk radio show can trigger an emotional response that spikes pressure as your body reacts to the stress of the news. The time to measure is a time for a mental shutdown, where you disconnect from the world and external stimuli completely. You need to create a bubble of silence around yourself for that brief period. Tell your family members that you cannot answer questions until the cuff is off. If you are alone, turn off the television and put your phone in another room so you are not tempted to check a notification that pings. The goal is to measure your basal or resting pressure, and you cannot be resting if your mind is engaged in a debate or a conversation. This is why doctors and nurses should not ask you questions while the machine is running, although many unfortunately do out of habit or politeness. If a nurse asks you, "How are you doing today?" while the cuff is tightening, politely simply smile and raise a finger to indicate 1 moment until the reading is done. It is your health on the line, and you have the right to demand silence to ensure the data is accurate. One more easy change is to close your eyes during the process, which further reduces sensory input and signals the brain to calm down. This is the ultimate do-nothing activity. For those 2 minutes, your only job is to exist and breathe. Removing the variable of speech is the easiest, zero-cost way to lower your reading instantly. The position of your arm in relation to your heart is a subtle geometry problem that most people get wrong, and it causes a significant error based on simple gravity. If your arm is hanging down by your side or resting on a low table, gravity adds weight to the column of blood in your arm, making the pressure reading artificially high. Conversely, if you lift your arm too high, perhaps propping it up on a stack of pillows above shoulder level, gravity drains the blood away and your reading will be falsely low. Thomas was a retired architect who loved precision, yet he was measuring his blood pressure on a low coffee table while sitting on his plush sofa. Because the table was so low, his arm was angled downward at a steep slope, placing the cuff significantly below the level of his heart. His readings were consistently showing him in the danger zone, often hitting 160 systolic, which terrified him because he felt perfectly healthy and active. I explained to Thomas that for every inch his arm was below heart level, his blood pressure reading could increase by as much as 2 points due to hydrostatic pressure. In his case, his arm was nearly 10 inches below his heart, adding almost 20 points of phantom pressure to his reading simply because of physics. This is not a biological problem with his arteries. It is a mechanical error of fluid dynamics that the machine cannot correct for. We adjusted his setup immediately. He moved to the dining table, which was higher, and we placed a firm cushion under his arm to elevate it until the center of the cuff was exactly level with his breastbone. The result was instantaneous. His systolic pressure dropped by 18 points, placing him squarely in the elevated but manageable category rather than crisis. He had been contemplating going to the emergency room, all because he was measuring gravity instead of his heart's true force. You must ensure that the middle of the cuff, where the tube comes out, is at the same vertical height as your right atrium, which is roughly the middle of your chest. If you are sitting at a standard table, your arm usually rests slightly below heart level, so you may need to place a small pillow or a folded towel under your elbow and forearm. This brings the arm up just enough to neutralize the effect of gravity, ensuring the sensor reads the pressure generated by your heart, not the weight of the blood. This is why doctors and nurses often hold your arm up while they pump the manual cuff. They are intuitively aligning the limb with the heart. At home, you do not have a nurse to hold your arm, so you must build a station that passively supports your arm at the correct height without you having to use your shoulder muscles to lift it. If you use your muscles to hold your arm up, the isometric tension raises your pressure, defeating the purpose of the elevation. Most older adults can try this safely by using a hardback book or a small box to create a platform for their arm if the table is too low. It feels unnatural at first because we are used to resting our arms wherever they fall, but for this specific measurement, precision is mandatory. Do not let the cuff sink below the chest. Treat the hose of the monitor like a level line that must go straight across to your heart. 7. Rushing into a measurement without a proper reset period is the single most common reason for erratic, high readings in active seniors. We live busy lives, and it is tempting to squeeze in a blood pressure check immediately after bringing in the groceries, climbing the stairs, or finishing a vacuuming session. However, physical activity of any kind raises your blood pressure to meet the metabolic demands of your muscles, and it takes time for that system to settle back down to its baseline. Patricia was a woman who was always in motion. She would run errands all morning, rush into the house, and immediately sit down to check her pressure because she wanted to catch it. She was seeing numbers like 155/90, which she assumed meant her medication had stopped working or that her condition was worsening. She did not realize that she was measuring her active pressure, which is naturally higher, rather than her resting pressure, which is what doctors use to diagnose hypertension. I told Patricia that she was effectively taking a snapshot of her engine while it was still revving from the highway, rather than checking the idle speed. I prescribed a strict 5-minute rule. She had to sit in her measurement chair, feet flat, back supported, in total silence, for 5 full minutes before even touching the start button. During this time, she was not allowed to read, scroll on her phone, or organize her pillbox. She simply had to breathe and let her body come to a complete stop. When she adopted this 5-minute buffer, her readings transformed. Her average systolic pressure dropped by 15 points, revealing that her medication was actually working perfectly. The spike she was seeing was just her heart doing its job to pump blood to her leg muscles after her walk, not a sign of disease. This waiting period allows the sympathetic nervous system to dial down and the parasympathetic system, the rest and digest mode, to take over. You cannot trick your body into resting instantly. It is a physiological process that requires time for hormones like adrenaline to clear and for blood vessels to relax. If you sit down and measure immediately, you are measuring the transition phase, which is notoriously unstable and inaccurate. Think of this 5-minute window as part of the measurement itself. The test takes 7 minutes total, not 2. If you find yourself impatient during the 5-minute wait, use a kitchen timer so you don't have to guess or keep checking your watch. Close your eyes and practice slow, deep breathing, which further accelerates the relaxation process and lowers the numbers even more. This simple discipline of waiting is often the difference between a good day and a bad day in your logbook. One helpful reinforcement is to keep a notepad nearby and write down what you were doing before the measurement if you forget to wait. If you see "walked the dog" next to a high number, you will know to disregard it as an activity spike. This prevents the panic that comes from seeing a high number without context. 8. Timing your measurement around stimulants like caffeine, nicotine, or even a heavy meal is a mistake that distorts your data significantly. Many seniors have a routine of coffee and toast in the morning, followed by their health checks, assuming that morning means after breakfast. However, caffeine is a potent vasoconstrictor for many people, temporarily tightening blood vessels and raising pressure, while digestion draws blood to the gut, which can alter systemic pressure in complex ways. Richard was a creature of habit. He drank 2 cups of black coffee every morning at 7 o'clock and then measured his blood pressure at 7:30. His doctor was concerned because his morning readings were always higher than his evening readings, despite him taking his medication at night. Richard insisted he was relaxed, sitting quietly, and doing everything else right, but he failed to mention the caffeine intake immediately preceding the test. I explained to Richard that caffeine blocks adenosine receptors, preventing the blood vessels from dilating fully, which can cause a spike of 5 to 10 points in systolic pressure that lasts for hours. Furthermore, the salt in his toast and the fluid volume from the coffee were adding to the load on his circulatory system right when he was measuring. I asked him to measure before his coffee, or wait at least 1 hour after finishing his breakfast if he absolutely had to eat first. The change in his numbers was clear. His pre-coffee readings were consistently lower and more stable, showing that his morning hypertension was actually caffeine-induced spikes. He was relieved to know that his heart wasn't failing overnight, but rather reacting to a strong chemical stimulant he was feeding it every morning. This is not to say you cannot drink coffee, but you must not measure your cardiovascular health while under its immediate influence. You should aim to measure your blood pressure before you eat or drink anything other than water, or wait at least 30 minutes after a light meal. If you smoke, the rule is even stricter. You must wait at least 30 minutes after your last cigarette, as nicotine causes immediate and sharp spikes in blood pressure. Measuring while these substances are active in your system is like measuring the temperature of an oven while the door is open. The data is corrupted by the environment. This also applies to certain medications that might be stimulants, such as decongestants for a cold, which can raise blood pressure unexpectedly. If you are taking a new medication for a cold or allergy, check your pressure to see how you react, but note it in your log so your doctor knows why the number is high. Always aim for the cleanest possible biological state empty stomach, no caffeine, no nicotine, to get the truth. Another helpful tip is to drink a small glass of water before measuring if you are dehydrated, as dehydration can sometimes cause erratic readings or a faster heart rate. Hydration helps stabilize blood volume, but avoid a large volume of liquid right before the test to prevent the full bladder issue we discussed earlier. It is a delicate balance of being hydrated but not overloaded. 9. The debate between wrist monitors and upper arm monitors is common, but relying exclusively on a wrist monitor is often a mistake for seniors due to the extreme sensitivity of the position. Wrist monitors are very popular because they are convenient, smaller, and easier to put on than a cuff that requires rolling up a sleeve. However, the arteries in the wrist are smaller and further from the heart, and the reading is profoundly affected by exactly where you hold your hand. Susan was a sweet lady with arthritis in her shoulders, which made putting on a standard arm cuff difficult and painful for her. She switched to a wrist monitor that she could slap on easily, but her readings started jumping all over the place. One day very low, the next day frighteningly high. She brought the device to my office, and I watched her measure. Sometimes she rested her hand on her lap, and other times she held it up to her chin. I explained to Susan that with a wrist monitor, if her wrist was on her lap, it was far below heart level, causing a falsely high reading. If she held it too high, the reading plummeted. The margin for error with a wrist unit is much smaller than with an upper arm cuff. The sweet spot is precise, and holding your arm across your chest exactly at heart level requires muscle effort that can also skew the result. We found a solution by getting her an upper arm monitor with a pre-formed or easy wrap cuff, which is stiff and clips onto the arm like a bracelet before tightening. This allowed her to use the gold standard upper arm measurement without the struggle of wrapping a floppy piece of fabric. Her reading stabilized instantly because the upper arm is at the same level as the heart naturally when sitting, removing the positional guesswork. The American Heart Association and most hypertension specialists recommend an automatic cuff-style bicep upper arm monitor for the most accurate home readings. Wrist monitors are acceptable only if an arm cuff is impossible due to arm shape or injury, but they must be used with strict adherence to instructions. If you must use a wrist monitor, you must place your wrist directly over your heart, usually by resting your elbow on a table and bending your arm up, but this introduces muscle tension. It is worth the extra effort or the slightly higher cost to get a machine that measures at the brachial artery in the upper arm. The anatomy there provides a stronger, clearer signal that is more representative of the central blood pressure in your aorta. Do not trade accuracy for convenience when the stakes are this high. The easier path is often the misleading one in medical monitoring. This supports steadier readings and ensures that your doctor trusts the numbers you bring in, as many physicians are skeptical of wrist monitor logs. If you bring in a log from a wrist monitor, your doctor might dismiss high numbers as user error, potentially missing a real problem. Using the gold standard equipment forces everyone to take your data seriously. 10. Relying on a single snapshot reading is a statistical mistake that leads to unnecessary panic and medication changes. Blood pressure is not a static number like your height or weight. It is a dynamic, fluctuating wave that changes with every heartbeat and every breath. Taking one reading, seeing a high number, and stopping there gives you a false impression of your true average. Linda was a worrier. If she saw a reading of 145, she would immediately stop, feeling defeated and anxious for the rest of the day. She would fixate on that single high number, ignoring the fact that 5 minutes later, it might have dropped to 125. She came to me convinced she had resistant hypertension because she frequently caught these high peaks in her daily check. I explained to Linda that the first reading is almost always the highest due to the settling in effect and the anxiety of the test itself. I instructed her to ignore the first reading entirely, to treat it as a warm-up for the machine and her arteries. Her new protocol was to take 3 readings, 1 minute apart, discard the first one, and average the second and third to get her real number. When she started averaging, her hypertension seemed to vanish. Her average was consistently in the healthy range, proving that the first number was just noise. This discard the first technique is used in clinical trials and research because the act of the cuff squeezing the first time can startle the body. The subsequent readings, taken when the body is used to the sensation, are always more accurate and lower. You should always measure at least twice, preferably 3 times, with a 60-second break in between to let the blood flow return to normal. Most modern machines have a function that automatically takes 3 readings and gives you the average, which is a fantastic feature to look for. If yours does not, simply do the math yourself, or log all 3 and let your doctor see the trend. Never make a medical decision or call the doctor based on a single high reading unless it is extremely high, like over 180 and accompanied by symptoms. Wait 5 minutes, relax, and measure again. Often, the second number will be significantly lower. This approach smooths out the random spikes caused by a stray thought, a noise outside, or a momentary shift in posture. Another helpful step is to breathe deeply between the readings, focusing on long exhales, which activates the vagus nerve and slows the heart rate. This active relaxation between measurements ensures that the final average represents your body at its calmest capability. It turns the measurement session into a relaxation ritual rather than a pass-fail test. The final mistake is ignoring the asymmetry between your 2 arms, a habit that can mask serious vascular problems or lead to undertreatment. Most people pick an arm, usually the left, and stick with it forever, never checking the right side. However, it is common to have a difference of 5 to 10 points between arms, and in some cases, the difference can be much larger due to arterial blockages. Michael was a diligent patient who had measured his left arm for 10 years, always getting readings of around 125, which made everyone happy. However, during a routine physical, I checked his right arm and found it was 155, a massive 30-point difference. This discrepancy was a red flag for subclavian stenosis, a narrowing of the artery supplying the left arm, which was artificially lowering the pressure on that side. Because Michael had only ever checked the low arm, his true systemic blood pressure, which was actually the higher number on the right, had been untreated for years. His brain and kidneys were being exposed to that high pressure of 155, but his monitor was lying to him because it was downstream from a blockage. We immediately started him on appropriate medication based on the right arm's reading, potentially saving him from a stroke. You must check both arms when you first start monitoring, or if you haven't done so in a long time, to see if there is a difference. If there is a consistent difference, you must always use the arm with the higher reading for all future measurements. The higher reading is the true pressure that your heart is generating and pumping against. The lower reading is just a result of a blockage or anatomical quirk. If the difference between your arms is consistently more than 10 to 15 points, you need to mention this to your doctor, as it warrants an investigation into your vascular health. Do not assume the lower number is the correct one just because it looks better. That is a dangerous form of denial. Accuracy means finding the maximum load your system is under, not the minimum. Once you establish which arm is the reference arm, stick to it for consistency, but do a spot check on the other arm once a month just to be sure. This habit ensures that you are not missing a silent progression of arterial disease. It is a simple check that adds only a few minutes to your routine, but provides a safety net for your entire cardiovascular system. This brings us to the end of the 11 critical mistakes. If you can correct these errors, from the simple full bladder to the complex arm asymmetry, you will have a set of numbers that you and your doctor can truly trust. If you know someone over 50 who could benefit from this, share this video and subscribe for more simple blood pressure tips.